It began with a single sentence whispered inside Clarence House, so explosive that even senior aides reportedly froze in silence. Prince William, according to palace insiders, had refused outright to accept a collection of crown heirlooms Queen Camilla allegedly intended to reserve for her own branch of the family. Within hours, royal corridors descended into controlled panic, and behind the polished palace smiles, a bitter inheritance war had quietly begun. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What made the situation so chilling was not simply the disagreement itself, but the fact that it reportedly unfolded during one of the most fragile moments the monarchy has faced in years. King Charles III, still battling the physical strain of cancer treatment since early 2024, was said to be emotionally exhausted and increasingly dependent on a shrinking inner circle. According to various interpretations of the meeting now circulating among royal correspondents, the atmosphere inside Clarence House had already been tense, long before Prince William arrived. Sources close to palace administrative staff suggest senior advisors had quietly assembled documents tied to royal heirlooms, ceremonial jewels, handwritten correspondence from Queen Elizabeth II, and several private artifacts believed to carry immense symbolic importance within the House of Windsor. What was expected to be a routine inheritance discussion allegedly spiraled into something far more explosive. Reports suggest Queen Camilla's position centered around securing certain protections for members of the Parker Bowles family as the monarchy prepares for an uncertain future. Insiders whisper that several items, pieces tied not merely to wealth, but to royal continuity itself, had become the subject of discreet conversations behind palace walls for months. And according to those familiar with the Duchy of Cornwall's rigid standards surrounding royal inheritance, Prince William viewed the mere suggestion of separating such heirlooms from the direct line of succession as deeply alarming. For William, this was reportedly never about sentiment or personal dislike. Palace insiders claim he believed the issue touched something sacred within the monarchy itself, the preservation of institutional continuity stretching back generations. The tension reportedly intensified when discussions turned toward private letters associated with Queen Elizabeth II's final years. Different interpretations of the closed-door exchange describe William becoming visibly firm, even cold, as advisors allegedly outlined proposals connected to the storage and future stewardship of sensitive royal artifacts. One royal correspondent later hinted that the room changed completely the moment the future king realized the scale of what was being proposed. And while no official confirmation has ever emerged from the palace, the silence that followed only fueled speculation further. Staff members were reportedly instructed not to discuss the meeting under any circumstances. Several aides allegedly canceled scheduled appearances. Even senior communications officials avoided briefing trusted media allies, a highly unusual move inside an institution built on carefully managed narratives. Meanwhile, Princess Catherine's appearance in the days that followed reportedly deepened public curiosity. Normally composed and reassuring during royal engagements, Catherine was described by observers as withdrawn, unusually tense, and emotionally distant. Sources close to Kensington Palace claim the Princess of Wales understood immediately how dangerous the situation could become if internal divisions surrounding inheritance ever reached the public sphere. Because within the monarchy, symbolism matters just as much as law. A jeweled brooch is never merely a brooch. A handwritten letter is never simply paper. These objects represent continuity, legitimacy, sacrifice, and the invisible thread binding one reign to another. That, according to palace historians, is precisely why Prince William allegedly reacted so strongly. But perhaps the most revealing detail came later, when royal insiders quietly began admitting that this conflict had not emerged overnight. Reports from The Times, Tatler, and several veteran royal commentators suggest tensions surrounding Camilla's long-term influence had been building steadily ever since Charles's health crisis became public. Some feared competing factions inside the palace were beginning to position themselves for the next era of the monarchy. Others described a growing unease among the old guard, particularly those fiercely protective of Queen Elizabeth II's legacy and the sacred traditions surrounding royal inheritance. and at the center of it all stood Prince William, a future king reportedly unwilling to compromise on what he viewed as the monarchy's sacred trust. But the real shock was not the disagreement itself. It was the centuries-old royal doctrine William was reportedly preparing to invoke against Camilla's plans. To outsiders, they were merely jewels, portraits, and ceremonial keepsakes. But inside the House of Windsor, these heirlooms represented something far greater: legitimacy, continuity, and power itself. And according to insiders familiar with palace traditions, Prince William believed those symbols could never be separated from the direct royal bloodline without risking the very integrity of the monarchy. That belief, palace sources now claim, became the invisible force driving the increasingly bitter divide unfolding behind closed royal doors. Because within the monarchy, heirlooms are not treated as ordinary possessions to be distributed according to personal preference. They are seen as extensions of the crown itself, physical reminders of sacrifice, continuity, and the centuries-old covenant binding sovereign to nation. And according to several royal historians, that distinction was precisely where tensions between Prince William and Queen Camilla allegedly began to spiral beyond repair. What appeared publicly as a quiet disagreement over inheritance reportedly concealed something far deeper: a clash between two entirely different visions of royal legacy. For generations, the House of Windsor has operated under an unspoken understanding that certain treasures belong not to individuals, but to the institution. Reports suggest Queen Elizabeth II spent decades carefully preserving that separation, ensuring that ceremonial heirlooms, royal correspondence, and historically significant artifacts remain tied to the sovereign line rather than becoming fragmented through private family interests. Palace insiders whisper that the late Queen viewed these collections almost as sacred guardians of continuity, particularly during periods of instability that threatened the monarchy's public image. And after surviving decades of scandals, divorces, abdication fears, and institutional crises, Elizabeth reportedly became increasingly protective of what some aides privately described as the sacred geography of the monarchy. That sacred geography stretched far beyond Buckingham Palace itself. It extended into Balmoral's mist-covered sanctum in Scotland, through the vast corridors of Sandringham, and deep into the protected royal archives housed within Windsor Castle. According to royal commentators familiar with palace traditions, every item stored within those estates carried layered meaning. A jeweled brooch might symbolize the transition between reigns. A handwritten letter could preserve constitutional guidance passed from monarch to heir. Even ceremonial artifacts tucked quietly inside palace vaults reportedly held emotional and political weight impossible to separate from the crown's identity. This is why insiders claim Prince William reacted with such visible concern when reports surfaced suggesting certain heirlooms might be privately reassigned outside the future sovereign structure. To William, according to those close to Kensington Palace, the issue represented a dangerous blurring of institutional boundaries. And yet, according to persistent palace whispers, Queen Camilla's allies viewed the situation very differently. Sources claim there had been growing private discussions surrounding the long-term security of the Parker Bowles family as King Charles's health struggles intensified. Different interpretations of those discussions suggest Camilla feared her side of the family could eventually be pushed aside once William ascended the throne. Reports now circulating among royal correspondents indicate that certain advisors allegedly explored ways to preserve select heirlooms, gifts, and symbolic possessions connected to Camilla's years beside Charles. Whether those conversations ever moved beyond preliminary stages remains unclear. But according to insiders, the mere possibility triggered alarm among the monarchy's old guard, because inside palace circles, fears surrounding blurred inheritance lines carry historical scars stretching back centuries. Royal historians frequently point to moments when divided loyalties weakened public trust in the crown, creating fractures that echoed across generations. Some senior courtiers reportedly believed allowing sovereign-linked heirlooms to drift toward private family branches could create exactly the kind of institutional confusion Queen Elizabeth spent her reign trying to prevent. And as whispers spread through palace administrative offices, concern reportedly intensified among figures fiercely loyal to the traditional structure of succession. Prince William, according to sources close to the future king, increasingly saw himself not simply as Charles's son, but as the protector of an inheritance system larger than any one family relationship. What made the situation even more explosive was the timing. With King Charles physically weakened and public attention fixed on the monarchy's uncertain future, insiders claim even minor inheritance disputes suddenly carried enormous symbolic significance. Royal correspondents began quietly noting unusual legal activity surrounding archival reviews, inventory checks, and private consultations connected to historic royal collections. At first, these developments attracted little notice outside palace walls. But within royal circles, whispers reportedly intensified that something far more serious was unfolding beneath the surface. And as pressure mounted behind the scenes, several senior figures allegedly began preparing for a confrontation neither side could fully avoid. However, insiders claim the dispute escalated dramatically once confidential inventory documents reportedly surfaced inside palace legal offices. Behind palace walls, whispers reportedly intensified over what some aides allegedly called the quiet redistribution. According to multiple royal commentators, Queen Camilla had become increasingly focused on securing long-term protections for her own family circle as King Charles's health struggles deepened. And that strategy may have collided directly with William's vision for the future crown. What made those whispers so explosive was the growing belief among palace insiders that the discussions had moved far beyond casual family conversations. Reports suggest quiet legal reviews had already begun examining ownership structures tied to certain heirlooms, ceremonial gifts, and historically sensitive artifacts connected to the late Queen Elizabeth II. According to individuals familiar with internal royal administration, these reviews were conducted discreetly, often through private consultations involving estate officials, legal advisors, and trusted members of Charles's household staff. Publicly, nothing appeared unusual, but inside palace corridors, the atmosphere reportedly became increasingly tense, as if senior figures understood they were standing dangerously close to a constitutional fault line. Sources close to royal operations claim the central issue revolved around what exactly constituted personal property and what belonged permanently to the crown's sovereign inheritance. That distinction may sound technical to outsiders, but within the monarchy, it carries enormous emotional and political weight. A single necklace, a handwritten royal note, or even a ceremonial object displayed during state occasions can become symbolic extensions of royal legitimacy itself. And according to insiders familiar with Prince William's position, he viewed any attempt to privately redirect such items toward non-sovereign branches of the family as an unforgiving breach of tradition. Palace commentators increasingly described William as deeply protective of what he allegedly called the institutional spine of the monarchy, a structure he believed had already endured enough instability in recent years. At the center of the growing storm stood Queen Camilla. Reports suggest her concerns intensified dramatically as King Charles's health condition continued dominating private palace discussions throughout 2025 and early 2026. Different interpretations of the situation claim Camilla feared her family's long-term position inside royal life could weaken once William eventually ascended the throne. Insiders whisper that conversations surrounding heirlooms and symbolic possessions were not necessarily motivated by greed alone, but by anxiety, an attempt to preserve recognition, security, and legacy for the Parker Bowles branch of the family before the inevitable transition of power. However, within the rigid traditions of the monarchy, even emotionally driven decisions can trigger devastating political consequences. Prince William's allies reportedly interpreted the entire situation as a dangerous overreach. Several palace staff members allegedly believed lines were beginning to blur between personal family loyalty and sovereign duty. And as these tensions spread quietly through the royal household, factions reportedly started forming behind the scenes. Some advisors were said to sympathize with Camilla's position, particularly those closest to King Charles, who had witnessed her decades of loyalty through scandal, public hostility, and institutional resistance. Others, however, aligned firmly with William's interpretation of royal continuity, arguing that sovereign-linked heirlooms could never become entangled in private inheritance arrangements without weakening the monarchy's future credibility. According to royal experts, this silent division created one of the most emotionally charged internal conflicts the modern House of Windsor had faced in years. Meanwhile, King Charles reportedly found himself trapped between two impossible loyalties. On one side stood his wife, the woman who had remained beside him through some of the darkest periods of his public life. On the other stood his eldest son and future king, increasingly determined to defend what he saw as the sacred framework of the crown. Sources familiar with palace discussions claim Charles became emotionally exhausted, trying to balance both realities while simultaneously managing the physical strain of ongoing treatment. Royal correspondents later hinted that private meetings inside Clarence House often ended without resolution, with advisors quietly leaving rooms carrying stacks of legal notes, inheritance records, and confidential archival references tied to royal estates, including Balmoral and Sandringham. As weeks passed, palace staff reportedly became hyper-aware that something profound was unfolding beneath the monarchy's polished public image. Communications teams allegedly tightened internal protocols. Discussions involving royal inventories became heavily restricted. Even long-serving aides were reportedly excluded from certain conversations altogether. According to insiders, fears spread that if the dispute ever leaked publicly, it could trigger damaging questions about loyalty, succession, and influence during one of the monarchy's most vulnerable eras. And perhaps most ominously of all, royal experts began quietly speculating that Charles's illness had accelerated tensions that might otherwise have remained buried for years. The uncertainty surrounding the future crown was no longer theoretical. It had become immediate, personal, and increasingly impossible to contain. But according to insiders, everything changed the moment William activated what palace aides allegedly called the Heir's Accord. Prince William reportedly did not shout. He did not threaten. Instead, palace insiders claim the heir to the throne responded with something far more devastating: procedure. Quietly, methodically, and with the full weight of royal protocol behind him, William allegedly began assembling senior advisors, constitutional experts, and trusted family allies into what some now describe as a coordinated royal counteroffensive. According to sources familiar with internal palace operations, the turning point came shortly after confidential inheritance concerns began circulating through Clarence House and Windsor administrative offices. While emotions reportedly ran high behind closed doors, William is said to have approached the situation with chilling discipline. No public confrontation emerged. No emotional statement leaked to the press. Instead, palace insiders claim the Prince of Wales activated an internal framework rooted in precedent, hierarchy, and institutional continuity, a doctrine some senior aides allegedly began referring to as the Heir's Accord. Within royal circles, the phrase quickly gained symbolic weight. It represented not merely a strategy, but a declaration that the future sovereign intended to defend the monarchy's inheritance structure at all costs. Reports suggest William immediately sought support from the two figures inside the royal family, most associated with discipline and constitutional loyalty: Princess Anne and Prince Edward. Anne, often described by royal historians as the monarchy's iron-willed enforcer, reportedly viewed the preservation of sovereign assets as non-negotiable. Edward, meanwhile, had spent decades quietly navigating the institution's legal and ceremonial complexities with almost invisible precision. According to insiders, both figures became central pillars in William's effort to stabilize what many inside the palace feared was becoming an increasingly dangerous internal divide. Palace commentators later claimed the alliance between William, Anne, and Edward created a powerful old guard bloc determined to place duty above personal relationships. As the Heir's Accord reportedly took shape, legal reviews surrounding royal heirloom classifications intensified dramatically. According to individuals familiar with estate operations, teams connected to royal archives and constitutional advisors allegedly began re-examining distinctions between private gifts, sovereign property, ceremonial regalia, and historically protected artifacts. What appeared on paper as administrative procedure soon evolved into something far more politically charged, because every classification carried consequences. If an item was deemed part of the sovereign inheritance, its future could become tightly restricted under royal convention. If categorized as personal property, however, different pathways allegedly opened regarding transfer, storage, or reassignment. Insiders whisper that these reviews quickly exposed just how fragile the boundaries between monarchy and family had become during Charles's reign. At the same time, reports emerged suggesting internal palace audits had quietly begun behind the scenes. Security access records, inventory movements, archival consultations, and estate communications were allegedly reviewed with unusual scrutiny. According to some royal correspondents, longtime staff members grew increasingly nervous as administrative oversight expanded deeper into areas traditionally handled through trust and informal understanding. Several aides reportedly interpreted the audits as a clear message from William's camp. The future king intended to restore rigid institutional control before any ambiguity surrounding royal inheritance could deepen further. And perhaps significantly, insiders claim those closely aligned with Camilla gradually found themselves excluded from key conversations surrounding sovereign assets and future estate planning. That shift reportedly altered the balance of influence inside palace corridors almost overnight. Figures once viewed as part of Charles and Camilla's trusted circle allegedly discovered they no longer held the same access to sensitive discussions. According to palace whispers, some advisors interpreted the change as a form of bureaucratic isolation designed to protect the crown's long-term stability from emotional or political interference. Meanwhile, royal historians publicly began emphasizing the importance of precedent over personal wishes, subtly reinforcing the very principles William's camp appeared determined to defend. Commentators repeatedly referenced earlier monarchs who prioritized continuity above private family considerations, framing the current conflict not as a domestic disagreement, but as a constitutional test unfolding during one of the monarchy's most vulnerable eras. And at the center of it all stood Prince William himself, increasingly positioning his role not as an angry son or frustrated stepson, but as the future guardian of the institution. According to those close to Kensington Palace, William believed the monarchy had already survived too many destabilizing battles in recent decades to risk further uncertainty surrounding inheritance, symbolism, and legitimacy. The issue, insiders claim, was no longer simply about heirlooms. It had become a struggle over the monarchy's future identity. Whether sovereign legacy would remain protected by centuries of protocol, or gradually bend beneath the pressures of modern family dynamics and competing loyalties. As pressure intensified, even King Charles reportedly began recognizing the scale of the institutional machinery William had quietly assembled. What started as whispers surrounding private inheritance discussions had now evolved into a full royal containment operation rooted in legal doctrine, historical precedent, and administrative power. And, according to insiders, the deeper investigators pushed into archival records and protected inventories, the more alarming the discoveries allegedly became. Some palace figures reportedly feared the reviews could uncover years of unresolved ambiguities surrounding ownership, classification, and succession planning, questions the monarchy had long preferred to keep buried beneath tradition and silence. Yet the deeper William pushed into the archives, the more explosive the situation reportedly became. Then came the documents. According to persistent palace whispers, confidential letters and inheritance memoranda connected to Queen Elizabeth II allegedly resurfaced during internal reviews, papers that reportedly carried enormous symbolic weight. And if interpretations of those documents were correct, they may have fundamentally undermined the very claims Camilla's faction was believed to be advancing. What made the discovery so explosive was not simply the existence of the records themselves, but the timing of their alleged reappearance. Reports suggest the documents surfaced during the increasingly aggressive archival examinations tied to William's so-called Heirs Accord. As legal advisors and royal administrators combed through decades of protected correspondence connected to sovereign inheritance protocols. According to insiders familiar with the reviews, Several sealed memoranda and handwritten directives tied to Queen Elizabeth II's later years suddenly became central to the conflict consuming the palace. Some royal commentators described the atmosphere inside Windsor's administrative offices as electric, with senior figures allegedly realizing the papers could reshape the entire inheritance dispute almost overnight. Sources close to palace operations claim the documents appeared to reinforce one principle above all others: continuity of the sovereign line. Different interpretations of the correspondence reportedly suggested Queen Elizabeth held deeply traditional views regarding crown-linked heirlooms and ceremonial possessions. Insiders whisper that the late monarch believed certain royal artifacts were never meant to drift into private family structures, regardless of emotional ties or personal loyalties. Instead, they were allegedly intended to remain permanently attached to future sovereigns as part of the monarchy's institutional identity. If true, those interpretations would strike directly at the heart of what Camilla's supporters were believed to be quietly pursuing behind the scenes. The significance of the alleged archive findings reportedly sent palace legal teams into overdrive. Constitutional experts, estate officials, and trusted advisors were said to have launched urgent reviews examining historical precedent dating back generations. According to royal historians, these precedents mattered enormously because the monarchy survives not only through law, but through ritual, symbolism, and inherited convention. A single memorandum from Queen Elizabeth II could carry immense moral authority inside palace structures, even without formal legal force. And as whispers about the documents spread through royal circles, growing numbers of insiders allegedly began concluding that William's position had gained devastating institutional momentum. Meanwhile, the emotional strain surrounding King Charles reportedly deepened with every passing week. Sources familiar with the monarch's inner circle claim Charles became increasingly overwhelmed by the widening fracture developing between his wife and his heir. Already weakened physically from ongoing treatment, the king was allegedly forced into an impossible balancing act, attempting to preserve family unity while simultaneously confronting mounting pressure from constitutional advisors and senior royals urging him to protect sovereign continuity above all else. Several commentators later suggest Charles appeared emotionally trapped between love and duty, torn between the woman who stood beside him during decades of public humiliation and the son preparing to inherit the crown itself. At the same time, media insiders began quietly noticing what they described as a growing isolation surrounding Camilla's camp. According to reports circulating among veteran royal correspondents, several figures previously associated with the Queen's private network allegedly found themselves distanced from critical discussions tied to estate planning and archival decisions. Invitations to certain internal consultations reportedly narrowed, communications channels tightened, and while no official acknowledgement ever emerged, palace whispers increasingly suggested William's alliance with Anne and Edward was successfully consolidating institutional control behind closed doors. To some observers, it looked less like a family disagreement and more like a carefully managed containment strategy designed to protect the future monarchy from internal fragmentation. As speculation intensified, royal commentators began using increasingly dramatic language to describe the unfolding crisis. One palace analyst allegedly referred to the situation as a silent palace civil war, not because open confrontation had erupted publicly, but because the struggle had become deeply ideological. On one side stood those prioritizing personal loyalty, emotional legacy, and modern blended family realities. On the other stood defenders of rigid constitutional continuity, determined to preserve what they viewed as the sacred architecture of the crown. And according to insiders, the resurfaced documents only widened that divide further, because they transformed private suspicions into something far more dangerous: historical legitimacy. Yet even as William's position appeared to strengthen institutionally, the emotional cost inside the royal family reportedly became impossible to ignore. Tension spread through private gatherings. Long-standing relationships allegedly grew strained beneath layers of silence and mistrust. Some aides whispered that members of the household had begun avoiding certain conversations entirely, fearful of triggering deeper conflict during an already fragile chapter for the monarchy. And behind every closed palace door lingered the same haunting question: whether the House of Windsor could survive this battle without permanently damaging the bonds holding the family together. But while the documents may have shifted the balance of power, the emotional fallout inside the family was only beginning. At the center of the storm stood King Charles III, physically weakened, emotionally cornered, and reportedly torn between two competing loyalties. On one side stood Queen Camilla, his closest companion through decades of scandal and redemption. On the other stood Prince William, the future king, insisting that duty to the crown had to outweigh personal attachment. According to palace insiders, the emotional pressure surrounding the king became almost unbearable as the inheritance conflict intensified behind closed doors. Reports suggest Charles spent months attempting to calm tensions privately, hoping the dispute could be contained before it hardened into something irreversible. But the deeper the palace descended into legal reviews, archival investigations, and institutional maneuvering, the more impossible neutrality reportedly became. Those close to the monarch claim he understood better than anyone how dangerous royal fractures could become once loyalty and legacy collided. He had lived through public scandals, family betrayals, and years of institutional humiliation. Yet insiders whisper that this conflict struck differently because it unfolded inside the very core of the monarchy itself, within the delicate balance between sovereign duty and personal love. At the same time, Charles' ongoing cancer treatment reportedly magnified every emotional strain surrounding him. Royal commentators have repeatedly suggested the king appeared increasingly fatigued both physically and mentally throughout the crisis, often carrying the visible burden of a man trapped between forces he could no longer fully control. Sources familiar with palace dynamics claim private meetings grew heavier, quieter, and emotionally exhausting. Discussions surrounding heirlooms and royal continuity allegedly became deeply personal, no longer confined to technical debates over inventories or precedent, because beneath every argument lay an unspoken reality. The monarchy was already preparing for the next reign, while the current king was still fighting to preserve stability during his own. Prince William, however, reportedly remained unwavering. According to insiders close to Kensington Palace, the future king refused repeated suggestions that compromise might ease tensions inside the family. To William, sovereign heirlooms represented something permanent and indivisible, symbols tied not to individuals, but to the crown itself. Palace sources claim he feared any concession could create dangerous ambiguity for future generations, weakening the institutional structure Queen Elizabeth II spent her lifetime protecting. And while critics allegedly viewed William's position as cold or overly rigid, supporters within the old guard increasingly praised him for prioritizing continuity over emotion during a moment of extraordinary uncertainty. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla reportedly grew deeply frustrated by the resistance emerging from senior royal circles. According to palace whispers, she believed many within the institution never fully accepted her place inside the monarchy despite years of loyalty beside Charles. Some insiders claim Camilla viewed the growing opposition not merely as disagreement over heirlooms, but as a broader attempt by traditional royal factions to quietly diminish her long-term influence before William's eventual accession. Reports suggest this sense of isolation intensified as more advisors appeared to align themselves with William, Anne, and Edward during the expanding internal reviews. What had once seemed like manageable palace tension now allegedly felt to Camilla's camp like a coordinated institutional wall slowly closing around them. Throughout the turmoil, Princess Anne reportedly emerged as one of the few stabilizing figures capable of maintaining discipline inside the increasingly divided royal household. Long respected for her unshakable devotion to duty, Anne allegedly worked behind the scenes to preserve institutional order while emotions threatened to overwhelm reason. Sources familiar with palace operations suggest Anne repeatedly urged advisors to focus on precedent rather than personalities, reinforcing the monarchy's long-standing belief that the crown must always outlive individual conflicts. For many within the royal establishment, Anne's presence reportedly became a reassuring reminder of the late Queen Elizabeth's own unwavering sense of responsibility during times of crisis. Yet despite those efforts, palace morale allegedly continued deteriorating as uncertainty spread deeper through royal operations. Staff members reportedly became increasingly anxious about shifting alliances, restricted conversations, and mounting public speculation. Insiders claim ordinary administrative routines grew tense, as aides quietly wondered which relationships inside the palace might fracture next. Publicly, however, the royal family maintained its carefully polished image. Charles continued appearing at selected engagements. William and Catherine carried out official duties with measured composure. Camilla fulfilled ceremonial appearances beside the king. But according to royal correspondents, the contrast between public calm and private turmoil had become impossible for experienced observers to ignore. Behind every carefully staged appearance lingered the growing sense that something profound inside the House of Windsor was beginning to crack beneath the surface. And perhaps that was what made the situation so tragic. This was no longer simply a disagreement about inheritance or protocol. It had evolved into a deeply emotional struggle between love, loyalty, legacy, and survival. A father trying desperately to hold his family together. A son preparing to defend the future crown. A queen fighting against what she allegedly saw as quiet institutional erasure. And surrounding them all stood an ancient monarchy built on traditions so rigid that even personal pain could not easily bend them. And as tensions reached their peak, insiders claim one final confrontation forced the monarchy to choose between sentiment and survival. According to royal insiders, the final meeting was cold, brief, and devastatingly formal. Gone were the smiles, the courtesies, and the careful public choreography. In their place stood a future king allegedly prepared to draw an unmistakable line in the sand. Crown heirlooms, he insisted, belonged to the monarchy, not to personal alliances, private loyalties, or blended family ambitions. By the time the meeting reportedly took place, months of silent maneuvering had already reshaped the atmosphere inside the palace. The archival reviews, the legal consultations, the quiet audits, and the resurfaced correspondence connected to Queen Elizabeth II had all pushed the monarchy toward a moment many insiders believed could no longer be avoided. According to palace whispers, senior advisors entered the room already aware that the discussion was no longer about compromise. It was about finality. Sources familiar with the encounter claim Prince William arrived carrying not anger, but certainty. A calm, disciplined resolve that some observers later described as far more intimidating than open confrontation. Reports suggest William's message was direct and uncompromising. Sovereign heirlooms, ceremonial artifacts, and historically protected possessions tied to the crown would remain permanently attached to the future monarchy. No exceptions, no reinterpretations, no quiet reassignment through private arrangements. According to insiders, the future king allegedly framed the matter not as a personal dispute with Queen Camilla, but as an institutional boundary that could not be crossed without damaging the monarchy itself. Some palace figures later claimed the emotional weight inside the room became almost unbearable, as William reportedly invoked continuity, constitutional precedent, and the long-standing traditions Queen Elizabeth II spent decades defending. For Camilla's supporters, however, the pushback allegedly landed like a devastating blow. Sources close to palace operations claim several figures aligned with the Queen had believed some form of negotiated settlement might still emerge behind closed doors. Instead, insiders whisper that William's refusal effectively ended any remaining expectation that the future sovereign would soften his position. Different interpretations of the meeting describe visible shock among certain advisors as the scale of William's institutional backing became unmistakably clear. Because by that stage, this was no longer simply William speaking as Charles's son. He was speaking as the future king, supported by senior courtiers, constitutional experts, and powerful royal figures determined to preserve sovereign continuity above all else. According to reports circulating among royal commentators, several senior courtiers allegedly reinforced William's position during the discussions, repeatedly emphasizing historical precedent over personal circumstance. Palace insiders claim references were made to earlier succession crises where blurred boundaries surrounding royal assets created confusion, division, and public mistrust. The message reportedly became impossible to misunderstand. The monarchy survives only when the institution remains larger than the individuals inside it. And in that room, according to sources familiar with the atmosphere, centuries of royal tradition appeared to close ranks around William's interpretation of duty. At the center of the confrontation stood King Charles himself, emotionally exhausted and increasingly isolated by the impossible burden placed upon him. Reports suggest the king made repeated efforts throughout the crisis to avoid forcing a definitive choice between his wife and his heir. Yet insiders now claim that during the final stages of the dispute, Charles reluctantly acknowledged that sovereign continuity had to prevail. Royal experts later hinted that the king's decision was less an act of personal rejection toward Camilla and more an acceptance of the brutal reality every monarch eventually faces. The crown demands sacrifice, even from those closest to it. Some commentators described the moment as tragic, precisely because Charles appeared fully aware of the emotional pain his silence would cause. In the days that followed, reports emerged suggesting disputed heirloom discussions were quietly removed from ongoing estate conversations altogether. Palace aides allegedly tightened archival oversight even further, while legal teams finalized classifications surrounding sensitive sovereign-linked possessions. According to insiders, the shift carried enormous symbolic importance. It signaled that the monarchy had chosen continuity over accommodation, institutional preservation over emotional negotiation. And while no public announcement was ever expected, royal correspondents increasingly described the confrontation as a defining turning point in the evolving power structure surrounding the future reign of William and Catherine. Media speculation soon intensified across Britain's royal press ecosystem. Veteran commentators began openly discussing whether the balance of influence inside the monarchy had permanently shifted toward William's generation far earlier than expected. Some described the outcome as evidence that the future king was already exercising quiet authority behind palace walls. Others viewed it as proof that the old guard, figures like Anne, Edward, and senior constitutional advisors, had decisively aligned themselves with the future sovereign vision rather than the emotional complexities of Charles's reign. And perhaps most striking of all was the growing perception that Queen Camilla's political space inside the institution had narrowed dramatically in the aftermath of the clash. Yet for all the legal victories, constitutional arguments, and institutional triumphs surrounding the confrontation, insiders claim the emotional scars left behind were profound. Because beneath the polished royal language about continuity and duty stood a family now more fractured, guarded, and emotionally distant than ever before. The monarchy may have protected its traditions, but according to those closest to the palace, something deeply human had been lost in the process. But in the aftermath of the confrontation, the monarchy itself appeared transformed forever. In the end, insiders claim this was never truly about jewels, portraits, or ceremonial treasures. It was about the future identity of the monarchy itself. And according to those closest to the palace, Prince William's refusal marked the moment a new royal era quietly began, one defined not by personal sentiment, but by an uncompromising vision of institutional survival. As the dust slowly settled behind palace walls, royal commentators began recognizing that the inheritance dispute had evolved into something far larger than a private family disagreement. What had started as whispers surrounding heirlooms and confidential archive reviews ultimately became a defining test of authority inside the modern House of Windsor. According to insiders, William emerged from the confrontation not merely as the future king, but as the unmistakable protector of royal continuity. Palace sources claim his handling of the crisis fundamentally changed how senior courtiers viewed the next reign. No longer was he seen only as the heir waiting patiently in the wings. Instead, many within the institution reportedly began viewing him as a sovereign already shaping the monarchy's future direction long before officially ascending the throne. That transformation, according to royal experts, carried enormous symbolic weight. For years, public fascination surrounding the monarchy often centered on scandal, personality clashes, and emotional turmoil. But the heirloom battle reportedly shifted attention back towards something older and far more enduring: the survival of the institution itself. Insiders whisper that William's refusal to compromise on sovereign-linked possessions reassured many members of the old guard who feared modern pressures might slowly weaken the monarchy's traditional foundations. To them, the future king's actions reflected the same disciplined philosophy that defined Queen Elizabeth II throughout her reign: the belief that the crown could survive only if duty remained stronger than personal attachment. Meanwhile, reports suggest Queen Camilla's influence within inheritance matters quietly diminished in the aftermath of the crisis. While she remained publicly beside King Charles during official duties and appearances, insiders claim the internal balance of authority surrounding royal estates and sovereign assets shifted noticeably toward William's camp. Several royal correspondents later hinted that key institutional decisions increasingly bypassed figures previously associated with Camilla's private network. And although no dramatic public fallout ever emerged, palace observers described a colder, more cautious atmosphere surrounding internal royal operations. The emotional wounds reportedly remained deep, even as outward stability returned to the monarchy's carefully managed public image. At the same time, Princess Anne and Prince Edward reportedly earned growing praise among palace insiders for their roles during the conflict. Royal historians increasingly referred to them as guardians of the institution, figures who prioritized continuity and constitutional discipline during one of the monarchy's most uncertain modern chapters. Anne's reputation for relentless duty reportedly strengthened further as commentators highlighted her unwavering support for preserving sovereign tradition. Edward, meanwhile, was quietly credited with helping maintain legal and procedural stability as tensions escalated behind closed doors. Together with William, they allegedly formed a powerful stabilizing force that many within royal circles believed prevented the crisis from spiraling into something far more publicly damaging. And still, at the center of it all remained King Charles III, a monarch carrying the emotional consequences of every decision made during the battle. Reports suggest Charles spent the months following the confrontation focused heavily on restoring calm inside the royal household while continuing treatment and managing the burdens of kingship. Sources close to palace operations claim the king became increasingly determined to project unity, continuity, and reassurance to the public, even as private fractures reportedly lingered beneath the surface. Because perhaps more than anyone else, Charles understood the painful truth at the heart of monarchy: personal happiness and institutional survival rarely move in perfect harmony. Beyond palace walls, public fascinations surrounding succession and royal continuity only intensified. Commentators, historians, and royal watchers began openly debating what William's actions revealed about the future monarchy taking shape before the world's eyes. Some viewed the crisis as proof the institution remained resilient despite internal divisions. Others saw it as evidence that the younger generation of royals was preparing to govern with far firmer boundaries than many expected. But regardless of interpretation, one message appeared to resonate across nearly every discussion surrounding the controversy: crown heirlooms were no longer being viewed merely as private royal possessions. They had become symbols of national continuity, historical permanence, and the enduring identity of the crown itself. And perhaps that became the ultimate lesson hidden beneath all the secrecy, heartbreak, and palace maneuvering. The monarchy, according to those closest to it, survives only when individuals are willing to sacrifice personal desires for something larger than themselves. Families fracture, loyalties shift, emotions collide with ambition and fear. But the institution endures because generation after generation is asked to place duty above comfort, permanence above feeling, and legacy above self-interest. Or, as one royal commentator quietly summarized after the crisis finally subsided, "The crown survives only when duty outweighs desire." And somewhere deep inside the silent corridors of Windsor, beneath portraits of kings and queens long gone, the monarchy reportedly chose legacy over loyalty, ensuring that the sacred inheritance of the crown would remain untouched for generations yet to come. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.